Okie dokie. Alrighty, well let's continue. I think we should have plenty of time this week, especially since you're not turning stuff into me. We had lectured through the first 2 pages of your terms, and we finished up with the cycle of the sarcomere contraction. And so this week let's introduce the neuromuscular junction. And I just got one request: if if you snore, try to turn off your microphone. All right. This stuff is okay. It's not my favorite, but we need to look at it nonetheless. That's just the way it works in life sometimes. You get to learn stuff that you didn't necessarily want to learn, and then who knows when it becomes something that you use. So knowledge is never wasted, but some of it I have to force myself for, and I'll confess this is it. So, but anyway, here we go. So I'm at the top of page 3. I'm on page 137. At least we get a pretty little picture. So on page 137, you see the neuromuscular junction, and that's what we're talking about this morning. You see the depiction of it as well as the blow-up. So the neuromuscular junction in a skeletal muscle is this: the muscles are controlled by nerves that stimulate their movement. That's what we've talked about the whole time, right? We've said from the beginning that if you're going to move, you're going to move as a result of nerves stimulating your muscles. So you can't just make your muscles move. You have to have nerves to connect to them, and of course the terrible and classic example of that is spinal cord injury. So motor neurons are nerve cells, the functional unit, I might add, of the nervous system. They're specifically designed to carry signals from the brain and spinal cord to the skeletal muscles at a high speed. And obviously that would have to be the case, because if I say to my hand, go get my cool, refreshing beverage, I don't want my hand to have to wait for a long time while I'm thirsty and wanting that drink. I want it to immediately be able to reach over here and aha, here is my cool, refreshing beverage. So the point is, these things are happening at incredibly high rates of speed. You know that intuitively, but we don't think about it a lot, do we? But that is the case. The top part of the motor neuron is the axon, all right? Notice it depicted there on page 137, the axon of a motor neuron, all right? This is a long process that extends far away from the main body of the cell, the muscle cell, to carry signals away from the main body, all right? The neuromuscular junction, and that is what is blown up there for you in terms of this neuromuscular junction, is the contact point of the branched axon and individual muscle fibers. The nerves do not touch the muscle, and that is very important. At no point does the neuron actually touch anything with regards to the muscle. It's this junction that we're going to discuss that accomplishes the task. It forms a gap, as a matter of fact, in terms of this neuromuscular junction, called the synaptic cleft. And look at that, that is pointed out for you in terms of that blow up there on page 137. Synaptic cleft is, the words are at the bottom, and you see the little area there, the white area. The synapse is the interface between a nerve cell and another cell. All nerve cells communicate with other cells across a synapse, all right, and that synaptic cleft is basically what we're talking about. The presynaptic terminal is at the very end of the nerve axon It contains mitochondria. Look at the little picture there. You see the mitochondria pointed out, as well as that presynaptic terminal. The mitochondria are producing the energy for the neuron to do its job. They also contain synaptic vesicles, which holds the chemicals of communication. The acetylcholine, that's ACH, which is a neurotransmitter. And so let's talk about neurotransmitters. They are chemicals released by a neuron that travels across that cleft there depicted, allowing the neuron to communicate with another cell. When acetylcholine interacts with the postsynaptic membrane, the membrane in this case of the fiber, muscle fiber in a synapse area, it creates a signal that ultimately causes the muscle cell to contract. That's how the work gets done. Acetylcholinesterase is an enzyme that inactivates acetylcholine so that the muscle is not continually contracting. So in some respects you could describe, maybe you can describe it this way in terms of what's actually going on. Not necessarily so, but a muscle spasm, when you've got a muscle that's contracted and it won't stop. And some of us get those in the bed when you move in the wrong way or you stretch in the wrong way, and that thing, oh my goodness gracious, does that hurt. But in any respect, it is the acetylcholinesterase that ends the contraction. All right, so that's a pause point. Is there any questions about that wonderful stuff? I did mention the video, that's right, so I won't repeat. Let's keep going then. Action potentials are an electrical message that travels down the axon of a motor neuron, causing synaptic vesicles to travel to the membrane of the neuron, secrete the acetylcholine there, and the acetylcholine interacts with the membrane of the cell, creating a new muscle action potential. So you've moved from a neuron action potential to a muscle action potential that travels along the muscle fiber membrane until it hits a T-tubule. Those are pits in the sarcolemma that cause the sarcoplasmic, that lead to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And you see the sarcoplasmic reticulums depicted for you there on the regular size in terms of figure 5.10. Now, in terms of that sarcoplasmic reticulum, let me just be sure. Yes, it is not depicted elsewhere. All right, in terms of that sarcoplasmic reticulum, it stores calcium ions that it gathers through active transport, and it expends energy to gather those calcium ions. When the impulse or action potential travels from the muscle fiber membrane to the T-tubule and into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it causes the stored calcium to be released. These calcium ions diffuse out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum into the myofibril, attaching to the troponin on the actin myofilaments. Let's just go back a little bit in terms of where we were. All right, so go back, if you would, please. Just kind of keep your hand on, or your thumb on page 137 and look at page 132. And that kind of reminds us of where we were last week in terms of the depictions here. So remember, the calcium ions diffuse out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum into the myofibril. It attaches to the troponin there depicted, and you see that depicted as well, on the actin myofilaments, causing the troponin and tropomyosin to rearrange, exposing the active sites on the actin myofilament, attracting the myosin head, and forming a cross bridge, and on we go, as we described last time. So that is this process in terms of the neuromuscular junction. I'm sorry. But anyway, the stuff is interesting, I suppose, but just it's not that interesting to me. Hopefully to you. Hopefully you like that stuff. How can he say that? I just love that process by which that acetylcholine is released across that synaptic cleft. How can he not like that? All right, I'll quit. Let's keep going. So we've talked about the contraction of muscle fibers. Now let's talk about how muscle fibers can relax, and that is on page 140. So okay, there you go. This is right here. That's the best part of the day right there, right? This is a rescue from this couple of years ago. Anyway, she's basically blind, and oh my goodness, what a dog that was. But and I didn't want anything to do with that dog. My wife would have every animal in the state. But anyway, and now this dog loves me, and I love this dog. But anyway, no extra charge on the veterinary stuff there. All right, how muscle fibers relax. That's on page 140 if you like to follow along in your textbook. And of course, I've got it for you in your notes. And please always remember what I'm interested in you being aware of and keeping track of, especially for testing. But really, what I'm trying to get you to learn is what I've got in your notes. So, not the whole textbook. So, how does a muscle fiber relax? Action potentials traveling down the neuron must be stopped in order for the muscle to relax. The nervous system must stop sending action potentials down the neuron, and when these do stop, acetylcholine is no longer released by the presynaptic terminal. So raising up here a little bit, see better. Where was I? Yes. Okay. No more acetylcholine travels across the synaptic cleft, but there is still acetylcholine interacting with the cell membrane, so what remains must be stopped, in this instance broken down, and that's where the acetylcholinesterase comes in. That's a protease produced by the muscle fiber. With the muscle action potential gone, the calcium do not diffuse, but they're actively transported back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Those calcium ions are removed from the troponin on the actin myofilaments, and the active sites are hidden and the cross bridges end. So once again, in terms of what we've seen several pages back on page 132, remember, we're just talking about reversing the process. As a matter of fact, that is the power stroke is described, and then the return stroke, that's right. In terms of the return stroke, what we've got is depicted there on page 135 and 134. So something that's always interesting to talk about, especially as we get ready for Halloween. Now, again, I don't know if you do the Halloween thing or if you don't do the Halloween thing. That, you know, I won't go there. But in terms of dead people, rigor mortis is maybe something you've wondered about. Rigor mortis is that stiffening of human bodies that takes place for a while at death, and it results from the absences of ATP production that's necessary to to produce the active transport of those calcium ions. Again, remember that's part there in terms of producing this response, those calcium ions back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, so the cross bridges continue to form without being able to get rid or produce the acetylcholinesterase to get rid of the calcium. Those cross bridges are still forming, and you still have a contracted muscle. Without the production of ATP, the myosin heads do not release their active sites. So the cross bridges are stuck, so to speak, until the muscle tissue degenerates. Relaxed muscle does not automatically stretch back. That's key. That's an important statement there in terms of when you contract a muscle and then, well, I suppose if you stop contracting, gravity can allow it to go back. But really, since it has no cross bridges, it can easily be stretched out by gravity, but especially then also the action of another muscle. And we will be talking about that too in terms of the movement of muscles in both directions. So, a motor unit. A motor unit is one motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers it innervates. So look at page 142 if you would please. 142, figure 5.11 is a depiction of such motor unit. And so the motor unit in terms of this thing is a small motor unit is one neuron that might branch 10 times, and that's kind of what we've got depicted here, is a small motor unit, and innervate maybe 10 different muscle fibers, and we've got looks like about 12, 11 or 12. Large motor units are those in which one neuron branches 1,000 times, innervating maybe 1,000 muscle fibers. The amount of branching in a motor unit affects how finely the muscle is controlled. So the big motor units will control large muscles. The strong, great, I almost ripped my coat out there. No. The biceps tend to be controlled by large motor units because what is needed is coarse power. You know, you're not necessarily doing anything in terms of fine muscle movement by flexing your bicep. But smaller motor units may be one neuron innervating 10 muscle fibers, and what that's going to do is give you precise control. We don't think about this, and so this is interesting stuff. This is good stuff in terms of the innervating of our muscle fibers. So you just think about what it takes. I'm looking at this computer, and right now there's 5 of you there. And so if I want to look at the individual names on this computer, I have to move my eyes just very slightly. Very slowly, well, not even slowly, but very slightly to be able to focus on those. That's a great great deal of precision that requires. And if you think about the strong movement of your larger muscles and what is necessary in terms of moving them versus this very fine movement of something like your eyes or your eye lids. It's a fascinating concept in terms of these motor units and how they move individual muscle fibers. So let me take a deep breath. See if there's any questions or comments on this stuff so far. All right. Let's look at, still on page 4, multiple motor unit summation. So a whole muscle is formed from several muscle fibers. Each individual muscle fiber within that muscle contracts to the same extent in response to every action potential. It contracts or it doesn't contract. It's an all or none law of skeletal muscle contraction. So if a muscle contracts, it's going to contract, and it's going to contract all the way. There isn't any limitation on that. All right? A muscle can perform in graded fashion because it is comprised of several motor units. Each motor unit acting according to the all or none skeletal muscle contraction principle. The motor units can combine to give a smooth motion to the muscle. So again, raising an arm slowly as opposed to, and perhaps you've seen people or maybe even known them who are afflicted by various conditions, and their movement is it's jerky, or it's sort of all or none and all the way. But again, in terms of the smooth movement, and again, that's the result of affliction. That's the result, really, of the innervation being broken down. In terms of this movement and combining, it's a number of different motor units working to allow for that. The neuron must be, the neuron must be stimulated to produce the action potential. The strength of the original stimulus determines the frequency of the action potentials. In other words, the stronger the stimulus, the more frequent the action potentials. The more frequent the action potentials in a motor nerve, the more the muscle contracts. All action potentials have the same strength. A large stimulus produces action potentials that are the same size as a small stimulus, but the nerve carries more action potentials per second in response to a large stimulus than a small stimulus. So again, in terms of the action potential, they're the same size, but it's the stimulus that causes the number of them in terms of, again, the movement. In terms of these stimuli, let me see, and this is, the summation begins on page 143, and sadly there's no pretty pictures for us, and this is going to be a lot of dinging here, so I apologize. But let's talk about these stimuluses. A sub-threshold stimulus is a stimulus too small for the motor neuron to respond, so you don't get a response as a result of that stimulus. A threshold stimulus is strong enough to trigger an action potential in a motor neuron. So that's what the stimulus that's necessary to produce that action potential is known as the threshold stimulus. A sub-maximal stimuli, those are stimuli of increasing strength that create more action potentials along more neurons, which result in more muscle contraction. A maximal stimulus is a stimulus which is strong enough to create action potentials in all the motor neurons, innervating the entire muscle. So again, you see the grades of these stimuli. Recruited is another term. A definition is when the muscle fibers in a motor unit have contracted. If only a few motor units are recruited, the muscle contracts with only a small amount of force. if motor units are recruited, the muscle contracts with greater force. So if you have only a few recruited, then you simply don't have as much force. If all of them are, then of course it's contracting with greater force. Multiple motor units summation in terms of this. Individual muscle fibers contract in an all or none way, while overall, I want to be sure about that. Let's see. Sorry about this. Yeah, it is. Okay. In an all or none way, while overall muscles contracts with differing amounts of force depending upon the nerve stimulus involved. So again, that's kind of interesting stuff in a way, but muscle tone is a fascinating concept, though. We've hit on another one that at least will wake me up a little bit, maybe you too. It's at the bottom of page 140, well, really the middle of page 145, and it is introduced there. So muscle tone is the state of partial contraction in a muscle. Even when the muscle is not being used, individual muscle fiber cannot be partially contracted, as we've said, but a muscle can be partially contracted when only some of its motor units are recruited. That's what we have been describing. So muscle tone does not disappear while you're sleeping. You relax, and of course some, in terms of your muscles, have been relaxed. They're not being recruited. The motor units aren't being recruited. The motor units within a muscle sort of take turns contracting and relaxing, so that some motor units are always recruited. The only way that muscle tone is lost is if the nerve that controls the muscle is severed. And so if any of you have known or perhaps have seen individuals again with nerve damage, spinal nerve damage, and particularly the spinal nerves, interesting thing happens in terms of others, but you've seen what happens in terms of muscles deteriorating, in a sense atrophying, from simply not being stimulated. They get smaller, and so that's really the only way that muscle tone is lost completely. And that very fact, in terms of the spinal column damage, spinal nerve damage, means that the muscle never has any action potentials. And so again, that is the word, the muscle atrophies and shrinks due to a lack of use. So we've actually hit the last page, and I thought we'd move right along today in terms of this last little bit in Module 5. So, energy in a skeletal muscle fiber. Okay, if you would, and want to follow along here, turn over again to the next page, page 146. I'm just with it today. I'm not sure what, but this is snoozer stuff again. I just gotta be honest, I suppose. Energy in a skeletal muscle fiber. Energy is stored in the cell in the form of ATP. The cell releases energy from its nutrients through cellular respiration. It takes ADP and adds a phosphorus to make ATP. When the cell needs energy, the ATP breaks down into ADP and phosphorus, and energy is released in the process. If some of you remember your chemistry in terms of the release of energy in those chemical reactions, that's what we're talking about. The three basic ways ATP is generated in a skeletal muscle. So there's aerobic respiration, and that is a three-step process in which glucose reacts with oxygen, and the energy released is used to turn ADP and a phosphorus into ATP. Aerobic respiration produces about 36 molecules of ATP for every glucose molecule burned. And so it's a good AT producer, but it is time consuming. And the muscle can't run on this if much energy is needed in a short period of time. So what we're talking about in terms of aerobic respiration is endurance type activities. Walking or long distance running, mowing the yard, something like that. So that's the first way that ATP is generated. Then there's also creatinine phosphate. When a muscle fiber has time in between high energy consumption, when it has created as much ATP as it can, it creates an energy reserve using aerobic respiration called creatinine phosphate. Then, when the muscle cells are needing more ATP, they can have time for aerobic respiration to produce. It uses stored creatinine phosphate and reacts with the ADP to produce creatinine and ATP. This is much faster than aerobic respiration. So the cell, as a supply of energy, I'm sorry about this, I left it on because of the zoom and stuff. So I'll have to come back to that one. So, where were we? There we are, creatinine phosphate. It's much faster than aerobic respiration. So the cell, as a supply of ATP, it is a supply of ATP that is produced in a hurry. Also, this reaction doesn't require a lot of oxygen, so it doesn't have to wait for the bloodstream to deliver the oxygen. The cell, however, only has enough creatinine phosphate to sustain itself for 10 to 15 seconds of vigorous contraction. In other words, it's a very short-term solution. It's a burst of energy, so to speak. And then finally, anaerobic respiration. So this is when a glucose molecule is broken down into 2 pyruvic acid molecules and 4 ATPs. This step requires 2 ATPs in order to get started, so net gain then is 2 ATPs. Pyruvic acid is converted into lactic acid, which then diffuses out of the muscle fibers and into the bloodstream. This is inefficient, but it's fast, such that during intense exercise, creatinine phosphate plus anaerobic respiration can provide up to a 3-minute supply of ATPs. Eventually, intense exercise causes the creatinine phosphate and the glucose to run out, so that there's no way to produce ATP. Also, too much anaerobic respiration causes that lactic acid. That's the stuff that's toxic to muscle tissues, and it also causes muscle tissues to fatigue and to cramp. That's the development or the building up of lactic acid is the pain in your muscles that you feel as a result of heavy, intense exercise. And because it can't diffuse into the bloodstream fast enough, it builds up. And again, that's as it being toxic to muscle tissue, that's what causes that pain. So last thing I'd like you to be familiar with is something called oxygen debt. And that is breathing heavily after exercise. That's me in the middle of some of this stuff. Usually continues after exercise because creatinine phosphate has to be relayed via aerobic respiration. You're trying to take in as much oxygen as possible. And then muscle fibers can convert the toxic lactic acid back into glucose, but it requires energy. Heavy breathing and after exercise, the muscle fibers produce ATP even though they're no longer contracting. They're producing ATP in order to convert the lactic acid back into glucose. So in terms of oxygen debt, that's it's simply what I'd like you to be familiar with in terms of these last pages. There's quite a bit there in terms of this stuff, and that's all I want you to be familiar with. So we have made it. We've made it early because, and I figured we would, in terms of not having to do anything at the end. And so let me just remind you that if you'd please bring your tests along next time, and we'll check your homework. If you have any questions about this stuff, again, the video should be up this evening or tonight. And of course, if you have any questions, my telephone number and email are on your new version of the syllabus. Again, I apologize about the wrong numbers for the stuff that's coming up, but they're corrected now. But holler if there's anything that I can help you understand or explain further. So that's all I've got. Is there any questions this morning? Why am I not surprised? All right, y'all. Well, you take care, and I hope you have a fabulous